The Holy Gospel according to Luke.
Glory to you, Lord.
And Jesus said to his disciples, "Therefore I tell you, do not be anxious about your life, what you will eat, nor about your body, what you will put on. For life is more than food, and the body more than clothing. Consider the ravens. They neither sow nor reap. They have neither storehouse nor barn, and yet God feeds them. Of how much more value are you than the birds? And which of you, being anxious, can add a single hour to his lifespan? If then you are not able to do a small thing as that, why are you anxious about the rest? Consider the lilies, how they grow. They neither toil nor spin. Yet I tell you, even Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these. But if God so clothes the grass, which is alive today, and tomorrow is thrown into the oven, how much more will he clothe you, O you of little faith? And do not seek what you are to eat, what you are to drink, nor be worried. For all the nations of the world seek after these things, and your Father knows that you need them. Instead, seek his kingdom, and these things will be added to you. Fear not, little flock, for it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. Sell your possessions and give to the needy. Provide yourselves with money bags that do not grow old, with a treasure in heaven that does not fail, where no thief approaches and no moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." The word of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
You may be seated. We continue as Jesus addresses anxiety. This is one of those passages that hits home. And last week we talked about how anxiety was really about looking for other things to satisfy us. That's all it is. Anxiety, in fact, has many different things. When we have so much more freedom to do things, we have more anxiety because the choices are so much more. Anxiety is almost a fear of fear. When we can label the things we're afraid of, that's fear. But when we can't, that's usually anxiety. And I don't need to tell you, but anxiety is around all the time. And one of the hardest things is to listen to Jesus' command when we'd rather not. Because deep down inside, we all like to be anxious, because anxiety deludes us into believing that we have some sort of control over our lives. And it comes in different forms, doesn't it? What you might be anxious about, your neighbor may not, and vice versa. I can still remember one of the most anxious moments I had experienced. It was in college. And I had just gone with a group of my friends and my old youth group, and we went to go see a band. And it was at that moment coming home that anxiety hit. Anxiety, not fear. I knew what had to be done. You see, I had 4 large projects at the end of the year, and there were only 6 weeks left. I had had a good time at the concert, but then the anxiety came in, and I realized that my time was limited. And I can remember later on getting back and laying on the floor of a friend's dorm room, looking up and wondering and lamenting, and just letting the anxiety wash over me. And then I prayed. Now here's the thing. the things that I had to accomplish, they didn't disappear. They were still before me. My problems still persisted. But my focus shifted from disorganized worry to a peaceful attention to the gifts that I already possessed, gifts that were laid out before me, my education, my skills, and the time that I still had remaining. You see, the anxiety wasn't going to fix things, but the focus would. Those next 6 weeks were spent gathering up resources and putting them together into projects. Somehow or other, the focus ceased to be a burden and instead became a motivator. I realized why it was that I was there and what it was I was doing, and I was refreshed. And the fragmenting worry of my anxiety never got things done. It was the peaceful considering of the resources that I already had. In our gospel lesson today, Jesus asks his disciples to consider the ravens of the air and the flowers of the field rather than being anxious about what they fear that they must be doing, constantly moving. As I was reading this, there was something that struck me. Something that you don't really pick up in the English, but in the Greek, it's interesting to hear Jesus counter these two things. He brings up two words, kataneo and murinao. And I'm butchering them because I don't know how to speak it. I just barely know how to read it. But kataneo and merimneo are used as counterbalances. In our lesson, Jesus asks us to focus on God's provision. That's the kataneo. Focus. Focus on the ravens. Focus on the lilies of the field. Focus on these things. As opposed to merimneo, which means anxiety. Means looking around and worrying, constantly being distracted by all the things that move in front of us, the latest thing. And what's interesting is the latter one is like a cloud. It doesn't exist. The things that it represents don't exist, and that's what our anxiety is. It doesn't really exist. It's constantly looking after the next thing because we think that the next thing is the most important thing, when in reality it's just the next thing that comes in front of our vision. So what Jesus asks us to do is to focus on the ravens, focus on the concrete things that we can see. And in doing so, we begin to see things differently because Jesus allows us to do many things. And he does this by asking his disciples and the crowd and ultimately us to lay aside our anxieties, to listen to the gospel, and to receive the kingdom. Lay aside our anxieties, listen to the gospel, and focus receiving the gift of the kingdom. Let's see how Jesus teaches us to do this by looking at how he showed that first century crowd. And it's important to note, he's speaking primarily to his disciples and then the crowd behind them. Now, this week's lesson, unfortunately, is often lumped in with last week's lesson. And the problem with that, of course, is that I get to spend 2 weeks on anxiety. So it's good to actually live what I preach. And these 2 weeks of anxiety, it's difficult to continue speaking. Didn't I already talk about this? And yet, don't we live in an anxious age? Maybe it's pretty good that it's broken up. Here, Jesus is heading towards Jerusalem. And as he does, he speaks to his disciples, as well as the crowd that's behind them. Jesus understands what anxiety really is. Anxiety, last week we talked about how it's idolatry. It's looking at the things of the world and worshiping them, as it were, imagining that through this transaction with the idols of the world, we'll finally get our heart's desires. We'll finally achieve that peace. But it's an illusion. But Jesus also understands that anxiety is imagining future problems that don't exist. And then offering ourselves and our work up to the false gods of this world in order to solve them. Laying aside our anxieties is really laying aside idolatry, laying aside false hopes, laying aside our faith that future problems and our current discomfort can be cured by devotion to what the world's gods ultimately can never fulfill. To do this, Jesus points his anxious disciples at the ravens. Such an interesting term. Luke uses ravens, whereas Matthew talks about birds. Ravens were often considered unclean in Levitic law. Ravens also were considered a bit scatterbrained. And so, if any group of birds deserves to be ignored by our Father, it's the ravens. And yet, are they worried? Are they anxious? They don't frantically store up food for uncertain futures because they have a faith that God will provide for them daily, their daily needs. And then he points to ask his people to really focus on those wildflowers, the lilies of the field. They don't anxiously spin. And yet God clothes them more beautifully than anything Solomon, the king that all of his audience would have known was the greatest king. They're clothed and arrayed in splendor beyond what Solomon can even imagine. And yet that useless beauty is burned and thrown away, existing only for a season, until it starts anew. These creatures have something that many of us forget or choose to ignore. They have kataneo. They have a focus on God's constant present provision, rather than focusing on what they may lack in the future. Before my prayers, I felt the pull of each one of those projects, what I lacked as I was thinking about my future self and how I would come up short. I could only focus on my deficiencies at the present, imagining that the deficiencies of my present would continue on until the projects were due and I had nothing to show for it. But after I prayed, I let go of my anxiety. Or rather, my anxiety was taken from me because, let's be honest, it's hard to let go of anxiety. There was a peace in seeing both my destination and the next steps that I would take to get there. This is the good news that Jesus has for us. Instead of minds that race with worry, there's a peaceful gift, a gift that we receive, the gift of the kingdom. And it makes a place at the center of our lives. And from that peaceful kingdom, then we radiate out our work, the things we do. We don't work in order to justify ourselves or to justify ourselves before the idols and the gods of this world. We work because we know that we are citizens of the kingdom. Even if our present bodies are full and our current clothes fit well, though, we will always be agitated by wonder and worry about wondering when these things won't. When will our clothes cease to fit? When will we be hungry again? Anxiety offers us a lie to this fear that if we work and worry, we will finally be secure and content, but it is a false gospel because it is not good news. All my anxiety about those papers and the projects never brought me closer to the destination that I was seeking. If anything, they took that destination farther away from me. My efforts were on what I needed to earn. They were on what I lacked. And the key is how we gain the peace that we crave. And that can only come when we accept what is offered, the gifts that God has for us. In our lesson, Jesus explains that the gift of the kingdom is not something to be earned, but is something that God freely gives to all of creation and especially to his people. In fact, Jesus states, "It is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom." How easy it is to overlook that. I think nothing drives me more insane than hearing the churches themselves imagine that God is withholding those things, waiting for us for some reason to have the right sort of lives that deserve those things. But here Jesus says explicitly, it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. God doesn't grudgingly withhold things until you and I are good enough or show that we deserve things. It means God delights to give us the kingdom. He sent his Son, didn't he? His gift flow from joy, not from obligation. Instead of the constant attempt to wrest our heart's desires from the idols of this world, we are promised that God lays them out before us. And all we have to do is accept them. In the end, it wasn't anxiety that saved me, but remembering that I had what I needed right at my fingertips. Like the ravens that gather what is before them, and the flowers that soak up the earth's bounty, I had only to gather what was already there. The lesson wasn't that God rewards those who pray for academic success, though. The lesson was that anxiety itself was preventing me from using what God had already provided. Prayer didn't change my circumstances. It changed my focus, what I lacked, and turned it into what I had already been given. What anxieties do you have? That's the question before you today. The question that I still face today. What causes you anxiety? Can you change it? If you can change it, then focus on what God has before you. And if you can't change it, and as Jesus says, it's as futile as trying to add a little bit of height. What causes you to lose focus? Because otherwise, if you lose focus, you will always be chasing the clouds of our world's empty promises. Instead, we must fix our sights upon the promises that are sturdy, the promises that we know to be true. In the end, our peace will arrive when we lay aside our anxieties, listen to the gospel, and receive the kingdom. Easier said than done, though. Anxiety lurks everywhere. But Christ's sheep have a hope that's big enough to open the gates of the kingdom and to close the doors on our daily struggles of anxiety. Perhaps if the world laid aside its own burdens and saw and heard the gospel in the lives of Jesus' little flock, they'd be able to rest in the kingdom too. And those big and small anxieties would vanish. You don't need to earn the Father's good pleasure. You already have it. The kingdom isn't something you achieve through anxious striving, but something you receive through a peaceful, faithful trust. And this is why Christ calls you his little flock. Not because you are weak, but because he loves and cares for you. Amen.